Okay, so now we're going to talk about any issues related to flow and trying to diagnose what could be the problem. So first and foremost, you have to understand that these systems function on the science of their filtration, and that filtration is made possible by the source water. Now, your source water is the water that you're using to supply water to your system, whether it's a garden hose at your client's house, whether it's a spigot from a commercial building or a sink. Either way, your source is going to have a huge influence in how your system is going to perform. So, what are some factors at play here when trying to understand flow? So, the flow of water inside your filters is actually relative to the temperature that the water is. So, you have to understand that in colder months, right? Let's say beginning of spring, right? It's just coming out of winter, using water that is below the surface. Groundwater is going to be much colder during those transitional seasons, especially. So at that point, you're going to find that you're not going to get as much flow in those kind of months versus the warmer season. So much like wood, colder temperatures allows wood to kind of constrict while you have heat. The wood will expand. Well, think about water like that in your filters as such. You have fiberglass filters in these stainless steel housings. So if you're running very cold water in these housings that are not designed to freeze, by the way, at that point, you're going to have constriction. You're going to have less flow. So before identifying any issues, understand the quality of your water. Okay? You could also measure how many gallons per minute are coming out of that source spigot. You may find that depending on the location you're using the system, you may not have adequate source pressure. That's where a booster pump kind of comes in handy, because at that point you can compensate for the lack of pressure that you are getting from this particular job. And that's why you may see a change in performance going from location to location. So you can measure your GPM, your gallons per minute. So if you are getting a high GPM into your system, but you're running into flow issues where you're not really getting much of an output out of the system, but you know you're getting a strong source, okay, let's trace it. Ask yourself this. The first step in your system is your carbon filter. When was the last time you changed it? Like I mentioned in TDS issues, or maintenance rather, the carbon filter, when it needs changing, is also going to create a stoppage in flow. So at that point, change your carbon filter and see if you have any flow improvements. Chances are it's as simple as that. And then at that point, you can also measure the output of your membranes as far as gallons per minute versus your waste fitting. Now, I don't have any water running through this system. It's just hypothetical. So first and foremost, you have your waste fitting, and I have the output of the system here. So one thing you can identify trying to figure out what's going on with your flow is you want to see how your restrictors are performing. Now, your restrictors create back pressure to allow water to flow, pressurize, and purify, with that rejection coming out of this hose. Now, how that is made possible is through that fitting. It has a little restrictor piece inside. Now, as it's taking dissolved gook and garbage, you may find that that fitting itself is getting clogged up, which would result in kind of a lack of flow through this fitting. However, you would have an associated TDS issue along with that. So it's a good thing to understand how your flow restrictor is supposed to be functioning. Ideally, you want about a 4-to-1 ratio for pure water to 1 wastewater. So, that being said, on the opposite spectrum, you may measure and find that you are getting way too much flow out of your waste restrictors and not adequate pure water flow. That means you're getting too much rejection, which could mean that your restrictor piece has failed and it's not restricting water. It's just allowing too much water to come through. That would also be associated with the TDS issue at that point, because really this filter wouldn't be performing as it should. So pay attention to your flow restrictors. So in regards to flow, we talked about temperature and how temperature affects your RO membranes. Again, I'm going to reiterate, the system is not designed to freeze. So if you find that you're going to use your system, perhaps it's a colder month, or it's just about to be the cold season, and you had a relatively frozen night, let's say temperatures hit freezing temperatures, but you kept your system in the van, and now you go to use your system, and you're getting a strange flow issue that you've never seen before. It's highly possible that the membranes inside, which are made of fiberglass that's wrapped and layered, have cracked, which means you're not getting proper flow inside, which you're going to have a whole bunch of issues at that point, which at that point I recommend changing all your filters anyway. So bear in mind, if your system has frozen and you're experiencing flow issues, your membranes are damaged and it's time for a change. Another thing you want to consider as far as trying to understand flow issues outside of the carbon filter and the RO membrane, you have your resin chamber here. And now resin is made up of beads. These resin beads that take out a charge from the water. They separate ions from the water. So if you imagine them like a marble, and the water molecule makes contact with this marble, now if this system has sat for a long time, that marble's going to get bigger. It's going to hit a point where it can't really do much. And if you decide to run water through this system that has sat for a while, well, because you have all those swollen resin beads that have absorbed and kind of hit a stasis where there's no exchange of ions, well, you're going to hit a stoppage in flow. Your beads are swollen, and your purification process has been limited to contact only because resin has expired at that point. So bear in mind, through usage of your system, resin kind of has like a self-cleaning effect. So as you're cycling water through, those ions are going to travel into the beads and kind of cycle through rather than getting locked into any biofilm from sitting too long. So just like you can experience microbial growth in your RO housings, you can experience that in your resin chamber. So I recommend, if your system has sat for a long period of time and you still have resin from your previous usage, change your resin. Do yourself the favor. That way you're not misdiagnosing and changing something else that you wouldn't necessarily need to change. Another thing to pay attention to as far as flow and your DI housing is making sure that your cartridge inside the housing is making a proper connection. Your seals are making proper seals. Because at that point, you don't want any water traveling where it shouldn't. And obviously that's going to result in either bad purification or an undesirable amount of flow. Flow is something that is highly relative to the water that you're provided with. So if you keep a booster pump handy, that'll prepare you for situations where you're going to have inadequate flow. So for the most well-rounded use of your system, keep a booster pump handy.